This is awesome. Monster Hunter Wilds dropped a PC benchmark tool that you can download for free. And while it's still like a 25 gigabyte download, it's a lot less than downloading the whole game to try to figure out how you perform before deciding if you can run this on your system, because this game is very heavy. And we saw that with the open beta a number of months ago. And now we're closer to launch, so hopefully this is more representative of the final state of optimization. Doesn't mean there's not room for a bit more. But this gives you a better idea of how you're performing. However, I really wish it did a better job of pointing out to the end user whether your frame rates are CPU limited or GPU limited in any particular scene. Because I do like that this goes through a large number of scenes. This is an over 5-minute long benchmark pass, and it has cutscenes, it has gameplay in a couple of different environments, it has some town hub areas, and you'll notice, especially as you get into the town hub areas, the CPU is often the limiting factor rather than the GPU. I'm showing PresentMon off on the side here. That's what this blue stuff is. This is not built into the benchmark tool, but I'm using this to display the GPU weight metric as well as GPU utilization. If the GPU isn't fully utilized, you'll notice that the GPU weight metric goes up, and that's indicating that something else in the system is a limiting factor. In this cutscene, the GPU is not really waiting, so this is GPU limited performance on the RTX 3060. Also notice there's some spikes in the frame time graph. I'm noticing that mostly during cutscenes on camera transitions. It seems like it has to load in a bunch of stuff on the camera transition, causing a frame time blip. And this is my second time through the run on this PC on these settings, so these are not shader compilation stutters. The good news is when it gets to more actual gameplay, I did notice those frame time blips don't seem to happen quite as often, so it does seem to be a lot more smooth. Now, this is a scripted benchmark, so I can't play through on my own to tell you what it feels like and see if I can trigger these, but you can see we've loaded into an actual gameplay scene now. Also notice that frame rates are dipping into the mid-50s here, even down into the 40s at times, and it's occasionally showing the GPU weighting slightly, but it's still mostly a pretty balanced presentation and mostly GPU limited at this point. And we're dipping into the 40s, which might be a good time for me to talk about what settings are we using here. This is what the game defaulted to on an RTX 3060 12GB and Ryzen 5 5600X, so mid-range PC from a few years ago. It defaulted to medium settings, but using DLSS performance level upscaling. And look at the clouds and stuff right now, look at the details. There's a lot of pixelation here. DLSS performance on a 1080p output is only a 540p internal rendering resolution. So even though DLSS is a very good upscaler, it is struggling. By the way, notice GPU limited right now, down in the low 40s. DLSS performance medium settings. So 540p upscaled to 1080p. Medium settings on an RTX 3060. This game is very heavy on the GPU in a lot of these scenes, especially when you saw that big vista looking over that area. But then as you get down to mostly sand, you can see that the frame rate's jumping up higher into the 60s. But also notice throughout this whole gameplay section, the frame time graph has been a lot smoother. So it hasn't looked particularly stuttery. And the GPU memory utilization is around 7 gigabytes. So 8 gigabyte cards would be fine at these settings. Now, I've tested out this same system on a bunch of other settings, as well as some other GPUs in the same system, as well as a full high-end build to see how far you can push things. So we'll look at a lot of stuff in this video, but I'm trying to give you guys an idea of what the whole thing looks like. And again, while the frame rate average here is around 60, remember we had scenes where it was down into the 40s despite these low settings on, respectable mid-range-ish hardware from a few years ago that's honestly got a better CPU than a PS5 and has a GPU that's not too far off from a PS5 type GPU. So to kind of put that into context. Notice with those camera transitions, we saw a couple more blips on the frame time graph. Now, we're about to go into a new zone where it enters like a town environment. When we do that, watch the GPU utilization and the GPU weight metric. It's already starting to spike up. Do you see the GPU weighting in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen? It's going higher now that we're getting more NPCs in the area. GPU utilization plummeting. We're down in the 40-something FPS range with very low 1% lows, and the GPU is waiting. The GPU is in the mid-70s, 80s right now, utilization. GPU is waiting for several milliseconds. We are CPU bottlenecked here. So just like in the open beta, although I can't directly compare because I didn't capture this scene during the original open beta, the more populated town environments are incredibly CPU demanding. And we can see here that it's mostly the CPU. Turning down the graphic settings isn't going to help. Putting in a faster GPU isn't going to help. That scene right there is going to be severely GPU limited. Now, this is the last section of the built-in benchmark. It goes through another little cutscene where they eat some food. Once again, on the camera transitions, you see a little more of those frame time spike blips. At least it's not happening during gameplay, so if it is going to stutter slightly, I guess I'd rather have it be during a cutscene than during gameplay. So there is that. Now, at the end, it spits out a benchmark score. It says we got an excellent result. So, I kind of feel like it's gaslighting me, though, because you saw that there were sections of that, including gameplay sections, where we were either GPU limited down into the mid-40 FPS range, or CPU limited in that town environment down into the mid-40 FPS range. And that's at medium settings upscaled from 540p. So I'm not quite sure that this is an amazing experience on this kind of mid-range hardware, although I would say it does seem playable. Now, this might be a reasonable time to mention their updated system requirements. Their system requirements are really frustrating because despite the fact that they updated them, they're still mentioning that their system requirements are based on using upscaling. So in this case, it's talking about for the lowest min spec, it's talking about upscaling from 720p to 1080p to hit 30 FPS lowest settings. But notice, well, the GPUs are only a GTX 1660 and 5500 XT, which again, not. I've seen games that support lower end GPUs, but these aren't like super amazing modern cards or anything. But you do need something to get in the door, and remember that's for 30 FPS upscaled to 1080p at the very lowest settings. The CPUs they're asking for are still rather beefy on this. Like a Ryzen 5 3600 often performs a lot like a PS5 CPU does in a lot of games. We're talking 12th gen Intel, even if it's a low-end i3 or 10400. And again, that's for 30 FPS gameplay. And you see why they're saying that, because we saw in that town area, even on a Ryzen 5 5600X, we were choking below 60 FPS in the town environments on that CPU. The recommended specs, they're keeping those same CPUs, but now they're saying we can hit 60 FPS, but there's a catch, using frame generation to hit 60 FPS. So yay, this game supports frame generation, but I think most people agree that that generating frames from 30 to 60 is not the intended use case for that. Going from 60 to 120 to fill out a high refresh rate display isn't bad, but the lower your input frame rate is, the worse the interpolated frames look, and also the less responsive the game feels. Because remember, generated frames don't make a game more responsive. They're saying that to get this at medium settings upscaled to 1080p, they don't say at what settings, but again, remember my RTX 3060 defaulted to DLSS performance mode when I booted the game, which is extremely aggressive upscale for 1080p and did look very pixelated. Again, that's what they're saying here. So this is where I feel like the system requirements chart, relying on saying it's hitting 60 FPS through frame generation isn't great. Also saying that they're using upscaling, but they're not saying at what upscaling settings. So again, they're saying that a 6700 XT or a 4060 Ti can play at high settings, 1440p, but upscaled, not saying how aggressively, and only to hit 60 FPS using frame generation. Keeping these same CPUs, though, the whole time, and then jumping up to even higher end CPUs when they get to their Ultra. But again, 60 FPS with frame generation. So I don't really like that. Anyway, I did run a whole bunch more tests, though, to try to get a better idea of what's going on. Now, one thing I wanted to look at was a higher end GPU on the same CPU I was using here with the RTX 3060 to again emphasize that in that town area, your CPU is very likely to be the limiting factor. So I jumped all the way up to a RTX 4070. Now, on a 4070 running the same system otherwise with the Ryzen 5 5600, we can go ahead and see that the overall frame rates are a lot higher. This is 1080p medium settings, although in this case I didn't use DLSS performance. This is running at native 1080p. You can see that because we're running at the higher frame rates, actually the CPU becomes the limiting factor even in this opening cutscene area, because we're achieving a higher frame rate than the 3060 could even when it was using DLSS performance. So notice that the GPU utilization isn't 100%, and the GPU is waiting, indicating CPU limitations or some other limitation within the rest of the system. So do keep that in mind. Also, if I jump further ahead in this benchmark section to this town area, you can see here that despite the fact that I put in the RTX 4070, our frame rates here are still in the kind of mid 40 to 50 FPS range, especially as we start walking through the town, right? But look, the GPU is barely being utilized and it's waiting for the rest of the system. So again, that's showing that the higher end GPU can help in some cases, but you will still see situations where you could choke on the CPU result, although at times it can produce a higher result. Anyway, so the overall average result on a 4070 on a Ryzen 5 5600X is a 73 FPS average, but because of that CPU limitation, there are certainly going to be scenes in the game that don't run super well. Also, there are challenging GPU scenarios, like this one where he's kind of going in this open field. The GPU is not particularly CPU bottlenecked right now. We're maybe seeing some limitations, but we're only hanging out around 60 FPS. And again, this is native 1080p medium on an RTX 4070. So there are scenes where even at 1080p medium settings, it is challenging in RTX 4070 to maintain 60 FPS. So this is where I feel like it's nice that this built-in benchmark goes through a lot of the game, but I think somebody just running it and looking at the FPS counter at the end could be misled a little bit about what is actually going on and what to expect in certain situations. Again, now frame rate's jumping up more like in the 70, 80 FPS range, doing a lot better there. Now, let's go ahead, since we're on the 4070 on the system, and talk about, so the 4070 seems capable of more, at least in most of the scenes, but in some of the harder scenes, you're getting that CPU limitation. So one thing you can do in CPU-limited scenarios is actually turn up graphics settings, because a lot of graphics settings increase the burden on the GPU, not the CPU. So this is the RTX 4070 trying to run 1080p Ultra, native resolution. So when it says custom graphic settings, it's because the Ultra settings in this game, all the settings in this game default to using upscaling at some level. Ultra defaults to DLSS quality. Medium, I think, defaulted to DLSS performance. High defaults to DLSS balanced. So do keep that in mind. So going up to Ultra settings, 1080p Ultra, notice that our GPU isn't producing that much lower frame rates here than we were at the medium settings, because again, at medium settings, we were encountering some CPU limitation. Also notice when we go back into this town area, our frame rates are going to be very similar because we're still encountering CPU limitation, even though we've gone up to Ultra settings. So our frame rates are still hanging out at the similar types of numbers to what we saw before. But again, if you get into these more GPU limited scenarios, this is where you'll see the impact of the Ultra settings. Notice we were closer to 60 FPS here when we were at medium settings, riding closer to the 50 FPS line in this same scene at the Ultra settings. So choosing the right settings in this game is going to be a little complex because of the difference between when you're CPU or GPU limited. But I will say during actual gameplay, rather than when you're fighting monsters, it does seem to be more likely to be GPU limited than CPU. Although again, here I am encountering CPU limitations here, even at 1080p Ultra on this pairing, right? 4070 with a 5600X. But if a 4070 was paired with like a 7600X or a newer Intel CPU, something like that, you might not be encountering those same sorts of issues. Now, as maybe an interesting comparison, what if I stay at 1080p Ultra native resolution, but we switch out the graphics card again, but we leave the CPU? So now we're jumping back to the RTX 3060, but keeping the CPU the same, but going up to Ultra settings and no DLSS. So how does the 3060 do in this case? So you can look at the frame rate number at the end. It's 41, but the nuance of that, and when are we CPU limited, when are we GPU limited, we could look at a lot by kind of skipping around through the video a little bit. So you can see at 1080p Ultra, no upscaling. The RTX 3060, at least in this opening cinematic, is mostly the limitation. And we're hanging out, it's not locking to 60 FPS, and it does drop significantly at times. The performance varies wildly during this cutscene at 1080p Ultra, to be honest. When it kind of pops back out into, I honestly wish they spent less time on the cutscenes during the benchmark, by the way. But anyway, when it gets into this area, this is one of the areas that is extremely GPU demanding when it has this like storm happening. And notice that the RTX 3060 at 1080p Ultra, and again it says custom because I turned off upscaling, is dipping into the mid 30s here, and this is not a CPU limitation. This is a GPU limitation. So this game is challenging our RTX 3060 pretty dramatically in that case. Again, this scene right here, where we're walking through this field and looking out over those long draw distances with lots of foliage and animals, this is GPU limited below 30 FPS. So I would say that the RTX 3060 is not going to do 1080p Ultra in this game particularly well, at least not without upscaling. Again, when we get into the town environment, we are now a little more balanced, where it's actually more of a probably GPU limitation with the occasional CPU limited spike, because both the CPU and the GPU are struggling to go beyond the 40 to 50 FPS range in this town environment. I did run the RTX 3060 through some more tests. I did try going down to medium settings, but turning off DLSS. So remember, the initial run I showed you was what the game defaulted to, DLSS performance with the medium preset. This is the medium preset, but with DLSS performance turned off. It's just the medium preset. We're only averaging about 49 FPS at medium settings native 1080p here, which I would classify as not amazing. You can see during the intro cutscene, you're hanging out in kind of the mid-40s, but again, the performance swings wildly during cutscenes. When you get into this stormy environment, again, it's mostly GPU limited, in the 30 to 40 FPS range, even at, like I said, native 1080p medium settings here. So not amazing performance there. As we get into this scene, again, barely over the 30 FPS line at native 1080p medium settings. So kind of rough. And then getting more into that town environment, kind of in the mid 40s to 50s. So yeah, 1080p medium on the RTX 3060, even when just limited by the GPU, not the CPU, is often just in the mid 30 FPS range. So there's that. Now, I did test out some other stuff. We've already looked at the 4070 on the same CPU at 1080p Ultra. What if we actually took the 4070 and went down to 1080p medium settings? So that's what we're looking at here. The final result, and this is, again, it says custom because I turned off upscaling. So 1080p medium settings on a 4070, but paired with the 5600X, which remember can introduce CPU limited scenarios on this GPU, averaging about 73. But what does that look like throughout the benchmark run? You could be up in the 80s in cutscenes, especially when, but again, you can be CPU limited during these cutscenes, right? The GPU is sometimes waiting on the CPU at 1080p medium here. As we pop into this area, though, there's actually a bit of a CPU limit happening, and the GPU is still working pretty hard, and we're maintaining around 60 FPS, but it certainly dips below. This is a challenging scene on both the CPU and the GPU. Again, this is 1080p medium settings. As we go into this area, you can see that we're averaging more into the 60s, although this is actually after he turned the corner. It's a little harder when he's looking out this way. So here you can see a little bit of CPU limitation, but mostly reaching the limits of the GPU and around 60 FPS. So you need around an RTX 4070 and 5600X to hit 60 FPS in this type of scene. That's rough. This is gameplay, right? This is a gameplay environment. You're riding the mount through the open world environment. So that's pretty tough. I also took a look at the RTX 4070 at 1440p, And I used the ultra settings at their default, which means this is including upscaling. So this is the RTX 4070 using DLSS quality. So upscaled to 1440p. And it's using the 5600X system again. So again, there are times where that can create a CPU limited situation. So you got to think about the whole system in this game. It's not just about the GPU or the CPU. In the opening cutscene type areas, we are mostly over 60 FPS and not reaching too frequently the limits of the CPU, although you can see a little bit of GPU weight happening. As we scroll past this cutscene and get into this kind of demanding gameplay area in the storm environment, you can see that the CPU limitations are occasionally being reached, and the GPU is also working pretty hard though. So again, the whole system struggling to maintain 60 FPS in this storm environment. And then as the sky is clear and we're looking out over this open field, again, showing some signs of reaching the CPU limit, but also mostly hitting the GPU limit as well. In other words, it's fairly balanced. Once again, they're both struggling to maintain 60 FPS. In fact, here, we are often well below 60 FPS in this scene. And again, RTX 4070, Ryzen 5 5600X, using DLSS at the quality setting. Again, there are some easier scenes where you're just looking at some sand and frame rates are a bit better. And actually now we're mostly CPU limited. And then here, as we get into the town, you can see once again, mostly CPU limited. The GPU is waiting. The CPU can't handle going much past the 40 to 60 FPS bouncing around in that range. So that's what it looks like on a 4070 on a 5600X. You're sometimes GPU limited, oftentimes CPU limited, and frame rates are not super high without enabling frame generation. Now, the other thing I looked at was, okay, what if you just throw in a crazy high-end system? What can the absolute best PC on the market handle? So let's go ahead and look at the 5090 at 4K resolution on a 9800 X3D. So if we do that, first of all, we could just jump to the overall benchmark results at the end. By the way, this is no DLSS and no frame generation. So I enabled the Ultra preset, but then turned off DLSS quality to force a native 4K resolution. That's why it says custom. And we're averaging at 90 FPS, and that's native 4K Ultra settings. So an ultra high-end system can just power through this game. If you want to look at a few of the scene-by-scene kind of examples, you can see this intro cutscene. We're often around 90 to 100 FPS, again, native 4K. And the GPU is generally at 98, 99% utilization, so it is mostly the GPU limit here. If we get through that intro cutscene area, here we go, into this super demanding scene that we saw the other system struggling with. Well, even at native 4K, if I freeze it here, the 5090 and 9800 X3D are delivering 70 FPS, but that's at native 4K Ultra. So they could probably handle more if we use DLSS or turn settings down. But this is pretty demanding area of the game with this stormy environment. And again, as we get into this area, looking out over the open field, you will see the 1% lows dip under 60 here. But it's for the most part average, hanging out in the 70s. But again, this is native 4K. We will look at upscaled results. Easier stuff where you're just staring at some sand. We're able to hit 100 FPS or so. And then again, as we get into the city environment, we can still maintain high frame rates. The 9800 X3D can power through this, and so can the 5090. So if you're willing to spend thousands of dollars on a PC, you can power through this with a good experience at native 4K Ultra settings. Cool. What if we used DLSS quality, which is actually what the Ultra preset defaults to? Well, now we can boost performance a bit further. You can see we're over 100 FPS in the intro cutscene area. For the most part, even in this scene, we got a bit more headroom. For the most part, in the 80 to 90, even pushing 100 FPS range at times when we're using DLSS quality. And then in this demanding area, overlooking, let me actually go back slightly. Where we're kind of, that particular vista is we've seen is very challenging. We can see kind of in the upper 80s, low 90s for the most part. So DLSS quality for the most part pushing us to around 100 FPS. And again, this is not using frame generation. So you could kick on frame generation from this baseline to fill out a high refresh rate display. Again, frame rates go up as we're staring at sand. And then as we get in the city environment, we are mostly around 100 FPS, but notice there are times here where the 9800X 3D was the limit. Not much, but you will see it. There's a little bit of GPU weight happening in that bottom left-hand corner. So if you keep your eye on that, but again, it's hitting high enough frame rates that I don't think that's particularly an issue or anything like that. And so the actual averages at the ultra preset, again, no frame generation, is like 111 FPS. That's using DLSS quality. The last thing I wanted to look at is what if I go all the way down to DLSS performance mode on this same system, but still at the ultra settings otherwise. Mostly to relieve the burden from the GPU to see if we could find any limits on the CPU, on the 9800X 3D. Is it struggling? One thing I noticed though is the frame rates aren't that much higher than they were at DLSS quality. They can be, but at times, maybe we're hitting a little bit of GPU weight here if you look at it closely, and we are exposing some limits on the underlying platform. Again, let's kind of skip ahead to this difficult lightning kind of storm environment. Yeah, maintaining around 100 FPS, but you can see spikes of GPU weight, indicating that this is also difficult on the CPU as well in this case, but not egregiously so. But I think that's why our frame rates aren't massively faster than they were at DLSS quality. Now, if we go into this environment, again, we can be hitting around 100 FPS here. For the most part, GPU limited. We can see there's not a lot of weighting happening on the GPU. Again, higher frame rates as we push into the sandy area. And then again, lower frame rates as we get into the town area. One thing I'd wanted to see is using DLSS performance, do we start to expose some limitation on the CPU? We do a bit here. We see some GPU weight right as we enter this area, and it's happening around 100 FPS. So it's looking like the 9800X 3D hits its limits around 100 FPS at that point. But once you're actually walking through the town area, you can reach above 100 FPS there. But again, this is a multiple thousands of dollars PC, but it's kind of interesting to look at what it can do. But again, I think more people are going to be on systems like, 4070, 5600X, and even more people are going to be on systems like, 3060, 5600X. And again, that's where it was concerning to me, where this was 1080p ultra native resolution, where we were often dipping into the 30s or 40s. Remember, even medium settings with DLSS performance, upscaling, was doing well in a lot of places, but was under 60 FPS in a lot of places as well. So that's what I've got for you guys. As far as I know, this would be somewhat representative of the actual game, but we don't have the actual game out yet. Considering it releases on February 27th, that's 20 days or so from now. That's 3 weeks from now. So, maybe there's a little more optimization that could be done, but I wouldn't imagine it would be a massive amount. And by the way, this is where you get the download for the benchmark. You just go to the Steam page for the game, and it has a benchmark available to download. And that I can praise. I think more games need to do this, especially games that are hard to run. I think it's nice to let people know what their system can do and make an informed decision on if that's acceptable to them. But once again, I do wish it did a better job, because some built-in benchmarks give a score screen at the end, which tells you how often you are CPU limited and how often you are GPU limited. And that's where I wish they had improved on this. So the tool I'm using here is Intel PresentMon, and I customized it to show the GPU weight metric, and that would be a really good way for you to get an idea of if your GPU is waiting for your CPU. If you're seeing the GPU waiting, then that's a good indication that your CPU is the limiting factor in that part of the benchmark. And again, we saw it change wildly depending on what scene you're in. It's especially the town areas where that CPU limitation mostly comes into play. Anyway, hopefully this is useful information for you guys, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.